He stood in the doorway with rain still on his shoulders and said it plain, the way a man says a thing he has already decided. I'll fix your roof. No charge. She did not answer right away. She only looked at him, at the water darkening the brim of his hat, at the calluses along his knuckles, at the honest tiredness in his eyes, and she felt something in her chest turn over like a page in a book she had not read in a long time. That was the last week of September, in a town called Cimarron Bend, 40 miles east of Durango, where the San Juan Range holds the sky up on its shoulders and the cottonwoods along Willow Creek go gold before anything else does. She would remember, later, that the wind smelled of wood smoke and wet pine. She would remember that a nail was already loose in the porch step under his boot, and that he had noticed it without saying so. And she would remember what she said back to him, months later, on a different porch in a different light, when the words had had time to earn themselves. Ethan Callaway was 31 years old, and he had come down out of the high country the summer before with 2 horses, a saddle blade of a jaw, and a habit of arriving where he was needed before anyone thought to ask. He was 6 feet even, lean the way ranch work makes a man lean, with weathered sun-brown skin, dark brown hair cut short under a low-crowned wheat-colored hat, and steady gray eyes that held on a person a beat longer than most men's did. He wore a faded blue chambray work shirt buttoned to the throat, a canvas duster the color of dry sage, dark brown wool trousers, and worn brown leather boots scuffed pale at the toes. He did not smile easily, but when he did it started at the corner of his mouth and traveled to his eyes like a lamp being lit room by room. He had lost a wife 8 years back, in Kansas, to a fever that took her in 3 days, and a boy the year before that, and he did not speak of either of them unless a person had already earned the right to hear. He had been working the Halloran spread for wages since May, mending fence and breaking colts, and he owned a small piece of grazing land 8 miles out of town he had not yet built on. He was, in every way that mattered, a man who had learned the price of announcing himself and had decided not to pay it again. Clara Whitfield was 29, and she had been a widow for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. On the afternoon the rain came through her ceiling and dripped onto the flour bin. She was tall for a woman of her time, with pale skin freckled across the bridge of her nose from too many summers, chestnut hair she wore braided long down her back or pinned up under a plain straw hat, and green eyes the color of Willow Creek in April. She wore a high-collared dove-gray cotton dress with long sleeves buttoned at the wrists and a full skirt to the tops of her boots, a plain white apron tied twice around her waist, and a small silver locket at her throat that had belonged to her mother. Her husband Samuel had been a decent man, a quiet man, a wheat farmer with a stubborn cough, and when the second winter took him she had sold the wheat ground and kept only the house and 40 acres of pasture and a milk cow named June. She ran a modest laundry and mending business out of her back room, and she baked bread on Tuesdays for the Halloran outfit and the Miller place and old Ned Ashby, who could not knead anymore because of his hands. She was, in every way that mattered, a woman who had learned to keep a house standing by herself and had begun, only recently, to wonder if that was the same thing as living in it. The roof had been going for a season. She had known it. She had climbed up in June with a bucket of pitch and done what she could, and she had told herself the rest could wait until spring, because spring was when a person allowed themselves to spend money they did not have. Then September came in wet, 3 days of steady mountain rain, and the drip in the kitchen became a stream, and the stream became a puddle that lifted the corner of the flour bin and stained the pine boards dark. She had been standing there with a rag in her hand and a knot in her throat when the knock came at the door. He had ridden into town on Halloran business and seen, from the street, the way one shingle at the peak of her roof lifted in the wind like a loose tooth. He knew the house. Everyone knew the house. It was the Whitfield place, 3 blocks off the main street, white paint gone chalky, a good porch, a bad roof. He had known Samuel Whitfield in passing, the way men in a small town know each other, enough to nod at, not enough to grieve. He had tied his horse to her fence and walked up the path and knocked twice. "I'll fix your roof," he said again, when she still had not answered. "No charge. I've got the shingles from the Halloran barn tear off. They're sound. Take me 2 days." She opened her mouth to refuse. Refusal was the shape her mouth had learned in 2 years. But she looked past him at the sky, which was doing that trick mountain skies do in the fall, going from bruised to bright and back again inside an hour, and she thought about the flour bin, and she thought about the winter that was coming, and she closed her mouth and opened it again and said, "All right, Mr. Callaway. Thank you. If you'll let me feed you your suppers, at least." He touched the brim of his hat. "That would be more than fair, ma'am." Then he went back to his horse and rode out to the Halloran place for the shingles, and she stood in her doorway with a rag in her hand and felt, for the first time in a long time, the peculiar loosening of a burden lifted by a stranger. That was on a Wednesday. He came back on Thursday morning at first light with the shingles and a hammer and a pouch of square nails, and he went up the ladder without ceremony and set to work. He worked in the way that men who have done a thing many times work, without hurry, without wasted motion, without any performance of effort. She brought him coffee at 9. She brought him a plate of biscuits and salt pork at noon. He came down for the noon meal and washed at the pump and sat on the porch step and ate with his hat off, and she saw for the first time that his hair had a little gray in it at the temples, and she looked away when he caught her looking. They did not speak much. He said the shingles were sound. She said she was grateful. He said the loose step ought to be seen to before the frost got under it. She said she had been meaning. He said he would see to it in the afternoon. She said she could not ask that. He said she had not asked. Then he stood up and put his hat on and went back up the ladder. The town noticed inside a day. Cimarron Bend was small, and small towns keep books on their own the way a general store keeps books on flour. By Thursday supper the news had traveled from Meg Halloran, who had seen him ride out with the shingles, to Dot Miller, who had passed the house on her way to the post office, to old Ned Ashby, who could see the peak of the Whitfield roof from his porch and had counted the number of times a certain dark-haired man went up and down the ladder. By Friday morning 3 women had already stopped by Clara's back gate on separate errands that did not, upon inspection, seem like errands at all. Meg Halloran, who was 50 and who had raised 4 boys and buried a husband and was afraid of nothing, was the first. She leaned on the gate and looked at the ladder and said, "He's a good hand, Clara. Steady. Doesn't drink to speak of." Clara said she had noticed. Meg said he lost a wife. Clara said she had heard. Meg said he's not a man who talks. Clara said she had noticed that too. Meg smiled the way a woman smiles when she has said what she came to say without saying it, and she went on her way. Dot Miller, who was 35 and had 6 children and a mouth that ran ahead of her good sense, came next. She said, "Well, Clara Whitfield, you've got yourself a project up there." She said, "Half the widows in this town would have found a hole in their roof by now if they'd known that was all it took." Clara colored to the collar of her dove-gray dress and said nothing, and Dot laughed and went on her way too. Old Ned Ashby did not come to the gate, because his knees would not carry him that far. But he sent his granddaughter Ruth, who was 12 and serious and had inherited her grandfather's habit of saying exactly what she meant, with a jar of blackberry preserves and a message. Ruth handed over the jar at the back door and said, "Grandpa says he saw Mr. Callaway fix the step. Grandpa says a man who fixes a step nobody asked him to fix is a man worth feeding twice." Then Ruth curtsied and left, and Clara stood in her kitchen with a jar of blackberry preserves in her hand and did not know whether to laugh or to sit down on the floor. He finished the roof by Friday evening. He came down the ladder with his shirt dark at the back and his hands raw, and he said, "That'll hold you 10 years, ma'am, if a tree doesn't fall on it." She said she did not know how to thank him. He said the suppers had been thanks enough. She said she meant to pay him something. He said no charge meant no charge. Then he looked at the porch step, which he had already replaced with a fresh pine board sanded smooth, and he said, "I noticed the barn door's off its hinges too. If it's not an imposition, I could come by Monday." She said, "Mr. Callaway." He said, "Ethan, if you'll allow it." She said, "Ethan, that is more than a roof." He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the doorway on Wednesday, and he said, "Ma'am, some things a man does because they need doing. That's all." Then he touched his hat and rode out toward the Halloran place, and she watched him go until the cottonwoods took him. He came Monday. He came Wednesday. He came the Monday after that. He rehung the barn door on the second Monday of October, working through a cold blue morning with his sleeves shoved up and his breath showing, and the sound of the hammer against the iron hinge was a plain, hard, honest sound that carried 3 houses down and made Dot Miller look up from her wash line and smile a private smile. He reset a fence post along the back pasture on a Wednesday afternoon, kneeling in the mud with his hands red from the cold water in the post hole, and when Clara came out with a tin cup of coffee for him, he took it without straightening and drank half of it in one swallow and handed the cup back and said, "Ma'am, that wire will hold your cow 20 years now," and he went back to tamping the post before she could answer. He cleaned out the flue in the parlor stove that had been smoking since Samuel died, on a quiet Sunday after the noon meal, and he did it without fanfare, laying an old sheet on the parlor floor to catch the soot, working with a long wire brush he had brought from the Halloran barn, and when he was done he had a black smudge along his jaw that she had to tell him about because he had not felt it, and he laughed, then the small ladderlet laugh, and wiped it off with the back of his wrist. And on a Saturday in early October, he built her a small east-facing window seat in the kitchen out of a stack of pine boards left over from the roof, because she had said, once, in passing, over a bowl of stew on a Tuesday, that the morning light in the kitchen was the best light in the house and she wished she had a place to sit in it. He built it in an afternoon. He did not tell her he was going to build it. She came home from delivering bread at the Miller place and found the window seat there in her kitchen, sanded and squared and set into the wall as if it had always been there, with a folded scrap of paper on it that said only, "For the morning light." She sat down on it in her dove-gray dress with her hand over her mouth, and she did not cry, because she was a woman who had learned not to cry in her own kitchen. But she sat there a long time, and the light came in the window the way he had told her, in his silent way, that it would. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Meanwhile, in the town, another book was being kept. James Ridgway was 34, a widower himself, the owner of the general store on Main Street, a decent man with a decent trade and a decent house and a decent grief he had put away 3 years ago and now judged himself ready to lift back out. He had been paying calls on Clara Whitfield since April in the way widowers pay calls in small towns, respectfully, at reasonable intervals, always with a small useful gift. A tin of tea, a length of ribbon, a good beeswax candle. He had asked her, in June, if she would consider walking out with him, and she had said gently that she was not yet ready, and he had said gently that he would ask again come Christmas, and she had said gently that he was a good man to wait. He was not a bad man. He was, in fact, a good man. That was the trouble. In the story a town tells itself about a widow and her widower suitor. The widower is supposed to be the answer, and any other man is supposed to be an interruption. James Ridgway had believed himself to be the answer for 6 months, and he had begun, quietly, to notice that he might have been mistaken. He came by the Whitfield place on the second Saturday in October, after the window seat, on the pretext of returning a mixing bowl. He saw Ethan Callaway on his knees under the kitchen sink with a wrench in his hand and a smear of grease along his forearm, and he saw Clara standing at the stove with her sleeves pushed up and a small unguarded smile on her mouth, and he said good afternoon to both of them, and he set the mixing bowl on the table, and he stood a moment longer than he needed to, and then he tipped his hat and went. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. He was, as we said, a decent man. But that night, in his own kitchen above the store, he poured himself a small measured whiskey and sat with it a long time before he drank it, and he thought about what it means to be the answer to a question that was never quite asked. The town chorus, meanwhile, sang. Meg Halloran, at the church social the following Sunday, said within Clara's hearing that a certain dark-haired hand was building furniture now, not just fixing roofs, and if that was not a proposal she did not know what one looked like. Dot Miller, at the same social, said within Ethan's hearing that a certain widow had been seen at the sunrise service 2 Sundays running, which was 2 Sundays more than she had managed in the previous year, and that a woman does not go to sunrise service for God alone. Old Ned Ashby, from his porch, told anyone who would listen that a man who builds a woman a window seat is a man who has already decided, and the only question left is when the woman decides to. Ruth Ashby, 12 and serious, said nothing, but she watched. And Clara, who had learned in 2 years to keep a house standing by herself, sat in the kitchen in the mornings on the small east-facing window seat with her tea in her hands and watched the light come up over the cottonwoods along Willow Creek. And she thought about a man who had said, "Plain, I'll fix your roof, no charge," and she thought about the way he had noticed a nail loose in a porch step and had not said so, and she thought about the fact that in 10 weeks he had not once asked her for a single thing. She thought, too, some mornings about Samuel. She thought about the sound of his cough in the last winter, dry at first and then wet, and the way he had held her hand at the end and said, "Don't wait too long, Clara. Don't be alone longer than you have to." She had promised him she would not, and then she had spent 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days doing exactly what she had promised him she would not. She thought about how she had kept his blue wool coat on the hook by the back door for a full year after the funeral because taking it down had felt, some days, like taking down the last bit of him she still had, and how she had finally folded it in a cedar chest in the loft the summer past and how the peg where it had hung had stayed empty since. She thought about the small oval-framed tintype of Samuel on the parlor mantel, 28 years old, standing beside the wagon on their wedding day, and she thought that a person can keep such a picture on a mantel their whole life and still be allowed to set another cup on the kitchen table. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. Ethan too carried his weather. He did not speak of the Kansas fever, but she saw on a Wednesday supper in the second week of October how he touched the small brass button on the cuff of his shirt when he set his fork down, and how his eyes went for one heartbeat somewhere she could not follow him, and how he came back from that place inside himself with the same small effort a man uses to climb back up a bank. She did not ask. She knew the shape of a man carrying a wife in his cuff button. She had a locket at her throat. She only refilled his coffee, and she said, out into the room and not at him, that the cornbread was better on the second day, and he said quiet, yes ma'am, it is, and the moment passed, and the two of them sat with their separate weathers on the same kitchen table, and there was, in that shared silence, more than there is in most rooms full of speech. The frost came the last week of October, hard and early, and it broke the pump handle at the back of the house on a Tuesday morning. She was standing in the yard in her dove-gray dress with the broken iron piece in her hand when Ethan Callaway rode up on Halloran business again. And he saw her, and he swung down without a word and took the piece out of her hand and looked at it and said, I can forge you a new one at Halloran's by Friday. She said, Ethan. He looked up. She said, why? He straightened. He held the broken pump handle in his hand and looked at it a moment and then looked at her, and he said the thing that a man says only once in a life in the plainest voice he owns. Because I have not been able to look at another woman since I met you, Clara Whitfield. Because I would rather fix your pump handle for the rest of my life than sit at any other table in this country. Because I lost my wife 8 years ago and I have not since believed that a man gets more than one of anything, and then I stood in your doorway in the rain and I found out I was wrong. I am not asking you for anything. I only wanted once to say it out loud so it wouldn't rot in me. She stood in the yard with a broken pump handle between them. She did not answer for a long moment. The wind moved in the golden cottonwoods along the fence line at the back of her pasture, where the pasture met the road that went out toward the Halloran place, and a single yellow leaf came down and landed on the shoulder of his canvas duster and stayed there. She thought, in that moment, about a man who had said, I'll fix your roof, no charge, and had meant it. She thought about a promise she had made to a good man in a bed at the end of a bad winter. She said, Ethan Callaway. He waited. She said, come with me. And she turned and walked toward the fence line at the back of her pasture, where the yellow cottonwoods leaned over Willow Creek, and he followed her. They stood at the fence. The creek ran below. He held his hat in his hand. She said, I made a promise to my husband before he died. I promised him I would not wait too long. I have broken that promise for 2 years and 3 months. I do not intend to break it any longer. She said, you have fixed my roof and my step and my barn door and my flue and my pump handle. You have built me a place to sit in the morning light. You have not once asked me for anything. I want you to ask me for something now. He looked at her a long time. He said, Clara. She said, ask. He said, marry me. She said, yes. Then she said the thing she had been carrying in her chest since the last week of September. The thing that was the other half of the sentence he had spoken in her doorway in the rain. She said, you offered to fix my roof for free. Then take the house. Take me with it. He set his hat on the fence post and he put his hands on either side of her face, careful, the way a man handles a thing he has spent a long time learning the worth of, and he did not kiss her yet. He only looked at her. Then he did. In the days between the fence line and the wedding, the house filled slowly with the small unspoken work of a life being rearranged. Ethan planed and rehung the loose parlor door that had scraped the floor for 4 winters. He replaced 2 rotted deck boards on the north end of the porch, laying them flush and true. He built a new latch for the root cellar, and he oiled the hinges on the front gate so it no longer sang out into the street every time a person came through it, and he took the tintype of Samuel down off the mantel one evening, careful, and dusted the frame with the corner of his sleeve, and set it back exactly where it had been, a 1/4 inch to the left, where the paint behind it was not sun-faded. Clara watched him do this from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, because a man who dusts another man's picture and puts it back where it belongs is a man who understands what a house is. James Ridgway heard about it Thursday, at the store, from Dot Miller, who could not help herself. He set down the ledger he was working in, and he closed it, and he stood a moment behind the counter with his hand flat on its cover. Then he put on his coat and his hat, and he walked the 3 blocks to the Whitfield place in the cold October afternoon, and he knocked at the front door. Clara answered. Ethan was inside, at the kitchen table, mending a length of harness. James took off his hat. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara, I came to say congratulations, and I came to say I meant every call I paid you these 6 months, and I want you to know I meant them honorably. I believed, for a while, that I was owed something for being patient. I want you to know I have thought about it, and I was wrong. Person is not owed anyone." He looked past her at Ethan, who had stood up from the table with the harness still in his hand, and he said, "Mr. Callaway." Ethan said, "Mr. Ridgway." James said, "You have my hand, sir, if you'll take it." Ethan set the harness down and crossed the kitchen and took his hand. James held it a beat, and then he said, in a lower voice, "She is the best woman in this county. If you are less than kind to her, you will answer to more than me." Ethan said, "Yes, sir. I know it." James let go of his hand. He turned back to Clara at the door. He said, "I wish you every good thing, ma'am. I mean that." Then he put his hat on and he walked back to the store in the cold, and he did not stop at the saloon on the way, and he did not pour himself a whiskey when he got home. He sat in his kitchen a long time in the dark, and then he stood up and lit a lamp and opened his ledger again, because a decent man goes back to his work. They were married the 2nd Saturday in November, in the small white church at the corner of 2nd and Elm, in Cimarron Bend, 40 miles east of Durango, with the San Juan Range white with new snow behind the town and the cottonwoods stripped bare along Willow Creek. Meg Halloran stood up for Clara. Old Ned Ashby, who could not stand for long, sat in the front pew with his granddaughter Ruth beside him, 12 and serious and holding a small nosegay of dried yarrow. Dot Miller cried loudly enough for 3 women, which was appropriate for the occasion. James Ridgway sat in the 4th row and did not cry, and when the vows were done he was the second man, after Ethan's own hand, to shake the groom's hand at the door. Meg Halloran said, at the doorway of the church, holding both of Clara's hands in both of hers, that a woman who has waited 2 years and 3 months and 11 days for the right knock at the door is a woman who has earned the sound of it. And Clara did not answer, because her throat would not let her, but she held Meg's hands a long moment before she let them go. They lived at first in her house, the White House 3 blocks off the main street with the good porch and the now good roof. In the spring, when the ground thawed, Ethan began to build on his 8 acres out toward the Halloran place, and by the following September, 1 year exactly from the last week of the September he had stood in her doorway in the rain, they moved into a modest, well-set house of his making, 3 rooms and a good stone hearth, with an east-facing window in the kitchen and a bench built into the wall beneath it for the morning light. She sat there the first morning with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the sun come up over the cottonwoods along the far edge of the 8 acres, and she said, out loud, though there was no one but him to hear it, "You fixed my roof for free." He was at the stove making coffee. He turned and looked at her. He said, "You gave me the house. And me with it." She said, "I did. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east." Old Ned Ashby lived long enough to see their first child, a girl, born in the last week of September of the year after that, and named Ruth, for the granddaughter who had brought the blackberry preserves. He died the following spring, peacefully on his own porch, in the light he had always preferred. Meg Halloran ran the Halloran spread for 20 more years and never remarried, and said, at every wedding she attended for the rest of her life, that the best proposals were the ones made across broken pump handles. Dot Miller had 2 more children and did not stop talking. Ever. James Ridgway married a schoolteacher from Silverton 3 years later, a good match by all accounts, and had a son he named after his own father, and when he saw the Callaways at the church socials he tipped his hat to Clara and shook hands with Ethan, and there was no ache in it, only weather. And Clara Whitfield Callaway, in the mornings, in the east-facing window seat in the kitchen of the house her husband had built for her on his own 8 acres 8 miles out of Cimarron Bend, 40 miles east of Durango, in the shadow of the San Juan Range, sat with her tea in her hands and watched the light come up over the cottonwoods, and thought, sometimes, about a man in a rain-dark hat who had stood in her doorway in the last week of September and said, "Plain, I'll fix your roof. No charge," and about what she had said back to him at a fence line above Willow Creek, 6 weeks later, in a wind full of yellow leaves. "Then take the house. Take me with it." And she thought that a life is not, in the end, a matter of the grand words a person says. It is a matter of the small work a person quietly does, and the moment, if a person is very fortunate, when the other person turns and sees it. If you have been waiting for someone to notice the small work you do, my friend, I hope this story finds you in a doorway on a rainy afternoon, and I hope the knock comes soon. And if you are the one on the porch with the rain on your shoulders and the words half-formed on your tongue, I hope you say them anyway. The people who love us rarely announce themselves. They just quietly face east. Thank you for spending this afternoon with me here at Frontier Hearts. If this story warmed a corner of your day, stay with me for the next one, coming soon. A young widower in the Colorado high country hires a quiet housekeeper for the winter and does not know, yet, that she has been writing his name in the flour on the kitchen table when he is out with the cattle. Until next time, keep riding.